Needing to submit this story to you for a while now. I don't have many scary memories or stories, but there's one that always stuck with me ever since I was a little kid, which is when this happened. I can't remember what state we even lived in at the time, but I know we lived in a small town that felt kind of quaint and pleasant to me. I was probably 3 or 4 when this all happened, so obviously my memories are a bit hazy on the details, but the main plot of the story, I definitely remember it perfectly. I attended this kindergarten in town. It was a pretty small one with maybe 15 little kids, and it was basically what you'd expect. A corner for toys, crappy art on the walls, nap time, a little recess in the yard, and the absolute typical kindergarten. And it would have been completely normal except for the fact that from day one of me attending that school, there was this one strange kid. And we'll just call her Annabelle. She wouldn't join in with the class. She wouldn't read aloud or paint or come outside for recess. She wouldn't do anything except sit in the corner, which everyone referred to as Annabelle's corner. And she didn't just sit there either. Oh no. She sat there making little figures out of Play-Doh and then smashing them with her little fist over and over. Or sometimes she'd pull the limbs off and then the head. Sometimes she'd lie them down and slowly roll the little plastic rolling pin over them. Either way, the end result was that she repeatedly made these Play-Doh people who came to a very sticky end. And from the day I arrived at the kindergarten, I started in the middle of the year because we just moved to the state, the teachers had already taken to ignoring Annabelle and just letting her do what she wanted. She wasn't causing any harm or hurting anyone after all. Naturally, none of the other kids were friends with her. Maybe they tried back in the day, but as far as I knew, they all just ignored the creepy girl in the corner and her Play-Doh playtime. Now, I had a cousin with Down syndrome, and while I could see that Annabelle didn't have Downs, I got it into my head that she had some kind of condition, and it was my duty to befriend her and be nice to her. And so after a couple of weeks of attending the kindergarten and a few more days of building up the confidence, I approached Annabelle in her corner. I was ready for her to just hiss at me or act hostile or ignore me altogether. What I didn't expect was for her to greet me with this big smile, introducing herself and asking me to sit down and suggest that we become best friends. And yet, that's exactly what happened as a little kid. I remember being slightly taken aback, but hey, this was exactly what I'd wanted, right? So I introduced myself too and sat down, and almost immediately, as if she assumed it's what I wanted, Annabelle began showing me how to make the Play-Doh figurines, and the various ways in which I could crush them. She didn't explain why we were doing any of this. It was like she figured that I already knew. But she had some particular instructions on how to make what I assumed to be random humanoids. This one had to be short, this one had to have a big nose, and this one needed some big old ears. And it soon became clear that we were making figures of both children and adults, and I'd say that there were maybe an 80-20 split between kids and grown-ups. Now, I went along with this for days because I was just happy that I'd managed to become Annabelle's friend out of all the kids in class, and it took a while for me to ask why we were doing this and what all this Play-Doh violence was for. And the answer Annabelle gave was not something I'd ever heard of before. It was voodoo, she told me. A little kid was talking about voodoo. Now, I'd just like to add here that Annabelle was a Caucasian blonde kid, and as far as I know, she wasn't from anywhere that really practiced voodoo or any sort of religion like that. And I am as convinced as I can possibly be that this wasn't some cultural thing and that she'd heard about the concept from one of her older brothers, of which she had 3, 2 of whom were into horror movies and all sorts of weird stuff like that. And I say this very non-judgmentally because obviously, as a Let's Read fan, I am too. And Annabelle explained what voodoo was to me, which I won't bother recounting because you all know what it is, but the key part here was that we were making these little effigies of our classmates and teachers, and one day, if we were lucky, the gods of voodoo would smile down on us and cause our actions against the dolls to be transferred to the person they represented. I asked Annabelle why'd we even want to do this. Why did we want to hurt our classmates and teachers? And she just looked at me like I was some idiot, actually rolling her eyes and said something like, "Because they're awful, you dummy." I didn't really agree, but the look on Annabelle's face made me feel like I really shouldn't voice that disagreement. Once she explained everything to me, I found out that one of the kids were regularly making dolls of what was another girl, who we'll just call Kirsty. Kirsty was popular, kind of bratty, and I guess I can see why Annabelle disliked her, even though we were just little kids. And the more Annabelle opened up to me too, the more I became to understand her. It seemed like when she first joined kindergarten, the other kids had actually bullied her a bit. I only know this now as an adult, but there was this whole thing with Annabelle's family where they were regarded as pariahs in the town, unfairly for a reason I won't get into, and so the kindergarten teachers had never really bothered to put a stop to the torment. Instead, Annabelle had found out about voodoo one day, and that's what set her on this path. I was torn. I didn't agree that any of the people really deserved to be dismembered or smashed or squished by gods, but I felt sorry for Annabelle too, so I just kind of humored her. And then one day, I noticed Kirsty hadn't been in class for a couple of days, and then the teacher took us aside and told us the bad news, in as sensitive a way as you really could. Kirsty had something called leukemia, a rare kind, and it was very likely that she wouldn't be coming back to school, and we might not see her again. They didn't explain the concept of death to us exactly, and at least in the way that I remember it, that they didn't handle it very well. But the short version is, they told us Kirsty was dying of leukemia. And to me, who didn't really understand how these things work, it felt like it had struck her out of nowhere. Obviously, you can see where my brain went as a kid. One of the gods of voodoo had smiled upon us and given Kirsty leukemia thanks to all the voodoo dolls that we kept making her out of that Play-Doh. And to me, Annabelle and I had effectively sentenced someone to death. And then the next week, my most disliked teacher, Mrs. Malley, slipped in the recess yard and broke her leg. We made voodoo dolls of her a lot too. I liked making those because they were big fat dolls and they were fun to smash and smush and squash, and I didn't like them anymore though. I mulled over everything in my head for a few days. I was the kind of kid who built up internalized trauma real easy. I have no idea why. My parents weren't all that strict, and I'd never really been in trouble for anything. But I would feel sick with guilt for days or weeks over the dumbest thing. For example, thinking a swear word silently in my head. And eventually, I'd either move on from it or confess it to my mom, who would inevitably just tell me not to worry about it. Now this time, though, I was certain that I was right to worry about it, and I didn't think it was my mom that I needed to confess to, but our main kindergarten teacher. And so one recess I went inside and told her everything, how me and Annabelle had making voodoo dolls and that we'd given Kirsty leukemia. And then we hadn't stopped there, and we'd broken Mrs. Malley's leg. Now here's where I think the teacher really messed up, whose name I genuinely forget despite how many years I'd spent angry at her. Now she must have been able to tell that I was sincere. She must have. I was crying and struggling to get the words out. I was clearly having a really hard time, but instead of gently explaining to me that this isn't how things work, that you can't create voodoo dolls out of Play-Doh and give classmates sicknesses, and that you can't make Miss Malley break her leg, this teacher screamed at me. She told me I was disrespecting Kirsty and Mrs. Malley, and that I was being a horrible little child, and she was seriously considering calling my parents in. I think the only reason she didn't was because she knew that she'd handled that badly, and she shouldn't have let her anger control how she reacted to me. Now, of course, this all made me feel really, totally awful, so I vented to my only friend, Annabelle, and then as soon as I had, I realized I just admitted to Annabelle that I'd ratted her out as well. And so then I started apologizing deeply for that, too. And Annabelle just sat there in silence for a while, like she was thinking really hard. I kept talking, suggesting that maybe we should just make a voodoo doll of the teacher because the gods would definitely smile on us this time. And eventually Annabelle just shook her head and asked me if I really was sorry that I tried to rat her out. Now, repeatedly, I insisted. I told her I'd do anything to prove it. And Annabelle just kind of smiled and she said she had an idea. We wouldn't make a voodoo doll of the teacher. Instead, there were other ways to do the voodoo god's bidding, and I could prove my support and love at the same time. Now the next day, she showed me the means of our revenge. It wasn't anything really complex, and it wasn't some elaborate voodoo ritual. Instead, Annabelle had a huge kitchen knife in her backpack, and she wanted me to take the knife come into the classroom when the teacher was alone at recess, and stab her 16 times. This, apparently, would make amends both to the gods and to Annabelle. Now, the story has probably illustrated that I was a pretty naive kid, and it probably makes it clear that I'm neurodivergent myself, but nothing, in no way, would have convinced me that taking Annabelle's huge knife and stabbing our teacher repeatedly was okay. And instead, it made me realize that Annabelle was some bloodthirsty psychopath who had a capacity for violence as a freaking kindergartner. Now, I know this because when I refused and told her there was no way that I was going to stab the teacher, Annabelle pulled a pair of small sewing scissors out of her backpack and stabbed me in the leg with them. It wasn't a little poke either. It was a deep, rough stab that caused blood to start gushing from my thigh. Obviously, I began to scream, and then so did a bunch of other kids when they saw the bleeding. As soon as it clicked in her brain what she'd done, I think Annabelle just gave up. She pulled the kitchen knife from her backpack and lunged at me. However, thankfully, she was just some little girl, and our teacher was not, and she was able to grab Annabelle from behind and very easily pull the knife away from her. I had to go straight to the hospital, so I didn't get to see the aftermath. My parents shielded me from most of it too, but what I do know is that Annabelle had to spend some time in an institution and even receive some serious therapy. There are things my parents still won't tell me about the aftermath, even though I'm in my first year of college at this point, so I can only assume that something pretty bad or tragic or both ended up happening with Annabelle. We moved away to a totally different state right after this, and of course, it's not like you could just Google for news stories about a mentally ill little kid. Now, really all I know is that for a couple of months my best friend at kindergarten was a potential killer who believed that she could do magic, and also that I was extremely lucky not to get killed. And that's the part that I don't like to think about. Whenever I tell this story, I try to play it off like I was some badass hero dodging knife swings and surviving some murderer, and it's the only way that I can really stay sane. I know that if I start thinking about it too hard, I'll just dwell on what could have happened, and I refuse to do that. And so this is my story. It could have been a lot worse, but the fact that it wasn't and the fact that I'm still here to tell the story is something I'm going to focus on above anything else. I know people like to fall asleep to your videos, but I have a story that sometimes still gives me nightmares to this day. I don't know why it creeped me out so much that, as an adult, I still sometimes have night terrors and sleep paralysis that revolve around it, but hey, I guess it takes all sorts to scare us. Now, this story wasn't a serial killer or a gunman or a home invader or anything like that. The scary thing here was a little girl I grew up with. Her name was Bethany, and we grew up together, and we were supposedly best friends. At least, that's what our respective parents insisted anyway. Now, this is going to make me sound like an idiot, but the truth is that I was Bethany's best friend, but she wasn't mine. Now, before you write me off, though, stick with me. I was Bethany's best friend because even from an early age, she didn't have any other friends. The reason for this is because she weirded all the other kids out. None of the other kids in the neighborhood, girls or boys, would play with her. She scared them with her odd behavior and the strange things that she would say about ghosts and witches and all tons of nonsense. Mostly, though, she had this habit of hiding in places and then jumping out and yelling at you to scare you. Other little kids don't really like that, and since Bethany made, quote, freaking our friends out her entire personality, they didn't really like Bethany either. Unfortunately, Bethany's parents and my parents were best friends. They made a group since college, and they stayed very, very close ever since, and they both had their first kids, me and Bethany, in the same year. We were born just about 1 month apart, and so our parents decided that we were destined to be best buddies, just like they were, and ever since we were tiny little babies, we were forced into being a pair. Now, Bethany took this rule of friendship very seriously, and that meant that she stuck to my side like glue, and as a little kid, I had no hope of having any other real friendships when Bethany was always there, creeping everyone else out and behaving like a total weirdo. She was also insanely protective and jealous of me, so any chance I might have had at establishing other friendships basically went out the window. Bethany just seemed to have no shame and no sense of decorum or restraint. She'd pull weird faces at other kids, and she had no hesitation about breaking wind or burping in front of anyone. She'd say extremely hurtful things to other kids, calling larger kids fatty and that kind of thing, and as we moved through elementary school, her vocabulary developed into calling people various slurs, usually things that just made no sense and didn't even apply to them. And the fact that I was associated with her as her best friend, it was an embarrassment and absolutely destructive thing to any social life that I might have had. If I even tried to bring up the topic with my parents, they acted like I was being so mean because Bethany was a little angel, and they just wouldn't see the fact that she was some creepy weirdo. The one strange exception to Bethany's behavior was church. Both of our families were Christians and we attended the same church, and in church, Bethany was like a totally different person. It was as if God genuinely calmed her and soothed some kind of devil in her. Thankfully, the kids at Sunday school mostly weren't the same kids from our neighborhood or our elementary schools, so we did actually have some other friends there. It was so strange, and to this day I have no idea if Bethany was putting on some act in church or she really did just feel compelled to be her best self. Church is important to the story too because it introduces the other main characters here. Marie, our babysitter from when we were really little. Our parents would frequently go out for meals or go to see the movies on Friday or Saturday nights, and Marie was their choice of babysitter from the get-go. I think she first started babysitting us when she was 14 and we were 5 or 6, old enough for our parents to feel comfortable leaving us with someone else. When everything ended, we were 12, so I guess Marie was 20, although she'd never gone off to college or anything like that. Marie would also babysit us at Bethany's house. There were various reasons for this, but mostly, Bethany had difficulty falling asleep anywhere but her own bed, and our parents would often be out long after it was time for us to go to bed. Bethany had this game where she tried to act as creepy as possible whenever Marie babysat us, but without Marie ever finding out. Somehow she managed this for 6 years. I don't know if Marie was just completely oblivious and unobservant, or if Bethany was incredibly clever and manipulative. Bethany had 3 different games that she played around Marie. One was the creepy sound game. Bethany would hide somewhere in the house and make a loud clicking sound with her throat, kind of like that ghost from The Grudge, and then if Marie heard, she'd convince her that she had no idea what was actually making the sound. I even heard Marie talking about it to Bethany's parents once, asking if they'd ever heard this strange noise. They hadn't, of course, because Bethany behaved like an angel around adults. And the second game was trying to make me jump and scream, and if she succeeded, I had to tell Marie that I'd seen a spider or a mouse because just like any other time I tried to push back against Bethany, she threatened to make my life a living hell. I did not want to find out what kind of horror Bethany would plan for me if she ever decided that I wasn't her best friend, so I just went along with everything that she threw at me. Finally, the third game was called Goblin. Bethany had this thing where she'd pretend to be a goblin, but it was honestly uncanny. She managed to sort of scuttle along the ground on all fours, pulling this genuinely horrifying face. She'd hide under beds or climb up on cabinets or wardrobes and act as demonic as she possibly could. And you know how people use that phrase, goblin mode? I'm convinced it was invented by someone who knew Bethany. And the way she turned this into a game was going goblin mode for as long as she could without Marie or other adults ever catching her. One time, I remember her crouching in the corner of the living room, putting her goblin face on while Marie watched television, and she managed this for an entire hour before getting bored and making me play some board game with her. As we grew up and moved from elementary school to middle school, I really thought, or at least hoped and prayed, that Bethany would grow out of her weird, creepy phases. Instead, they just got worse. Middle school presented her with a whole new group of kids to alienate and freak out. Thankfully, middle school allowed me to make a few other friends and vent to them about how much Bethany drove me crazy and how embarrassing I found her. It wasn't much, but word did start getting around that I was more than Bethany's sidekick and didn't actually approve of or endorse her rude, vulgar, and insulting behavior. And this was especially relieving as she was going through her constantly saying slurs era, usually based on nothing and totally unrelated to the person that she was hurling that slur at. I can't give examples without getting this video demonetized, obviously, but for example, Imagine a slur aimed at a homosexual man being used against an 11-year-old girl, or a little white boy being called, well, you can imagine the kind of things. Now, once again, she just wanted to be as weird and off-putting as possible, and I was starting to get really sick of it. Our parents showed no signs of drifting apart, which meant that Bethany and I were being forced to spend almost every weekend together. Nearly every Friday, they would go out to dinner with a group from church and wouldn't return home until it was well past midnight, so I would have sleepovers at Bethany's house almost every single Friday, and it was hell. Now, I wanted to start hanging out with my other friends and living a life of my own. I could tell something had changed with Bethany on the Friday that this all kicked off, but I couldn't put my finger on it exactly. She was sort of aloof with me, acting as if she didn't care that I was there, when normally she'd behave like a hyperactive child whenever we had a sleepover. Our parents had been gone for a few hours, and Marie was downstairs doing some kind of homework, so I guess she must have been attending some kind of school thinking about it. And maybe she was doing college remotely, I have no idea. No, anyway, Bethany had told me she wanted some alone time and left me in the living room watching TV, but eventually she told me to come upstairs to play Scrabble. Bethany loved Scrabble because she'd make up words and insist that they were real, so she always won. Now, she also enjoyed putting rude words down on the board. When I went upstairs, the Scrabble game wasn't set up, and instead, Bethany was sitting at her desk, fingers poised like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. And she stared at me for what felt like minutes and then finally spoke and told me that she'd heard from a little birdie that I'd been saying mean things about her at school behind her back. Now, at first, I had no idea what she was talking about, but then I realized. I had disavowed her behavior and bitched about her to other kids. And while I don't think anyone ratted me out to Bethany, I think she overheard some kids defending me or saying that I wasn't as bad as my weird friend or something like that. Bethany said that she knew that I'd been calling her a weirdo and telling other kids that I didn't like her, so there was no point in denying it, and if I tried, then she'd make things worse. And then her face split into this really creepy grin, and she told me that it didn't matter. We were still best friends, and if I promised to stay loyal to her from then on, she'd forgive me. Of course, being terrified of her and lacking much of a backbone, I begged her forgiveness and promised that I'd stay best friends with her. And for the rest of the night, Bethany constantly played two of her favorite games. She'd disappear off and make the weird grudge sound which Marie had started ignoring years ago, and then she would constantly jump out at me from places to scare me. This time, though, the game changed. I wasn't allowed to scream or let Marie know that I was scared. This was now suddenly part of the terms of her forgiving me for insulting her. I think I pulled it off really well. If I hadn't stressed it enough, Bethany could be incredibly creepy, and she managed to squeeze into the most impossible hiding spots and jump out from the craziest areas. I think I must have stifled well over 20 screams that night, determined not to invoke whatever hypothetical anger she threatened me with. No, I was just grateful that she didn't decide to combine it all with her goblin impression. I'm not sure that I could have handled seeing Bethany scooting across the floor out of nowhere that night. I was already jumpy enough as it was. Now, eventually, it was our bedtime, so we headed to our respective bedrooms. And that was one of the things that I did like about sleepovers at Bethany's. They had a guest room, and when I slept over, I was able to use it. Our parents didn't like the idea of us keeping each other up by talking all night, and was a rule that I was more than happy to follow now. And I guess the bedroom also had a lock, and due to Bethany's love for scaring me, I'd always locked it before I went to sleep ever since I was young. It had given me a degree of safety, but I found out that night it was completely misplaced. Bethany had always had a key to my room, I suppose, and simply waited for the right time to use it. I had no idea what had woken me up. I blinked in the darkness, trying my best to let my eyes adjust, and then I heard it again. Bethany's stupid, croaking ghost noise. And that's when I realized where she was. She was standing on the wooden footboard of the bed, balancing there in some bizarre crouch. Her face was full goblin mode, and she'd done something to her hair to make it stick up everywhere. I reached out and turned on the lamp and saw the full creepy weirdness of Bethany's goblin mode. She was dressed only in her underwear, and she'd written all sorts of strange words and symbols all over her body in what looked like lipstick. When she smiled, I saw that her teeth was also covered in lipstick too, and then she spoke in this weird goblin voice, and I'll never forget what she said.
Do you think I'm weird enough now?
And with that, she leaped off the foot of the bed and landed on me. And then she began smearing something on my face, which I later found out was the same lipstick that she'd used to write on herself. And at the same time, she kept spitting on me, saying she wanted to make me weird like her. I managed to scream, but I think Marie must have heard the commotion already, as she came bursting into the room, and then I heard her screaming. My first thought was that my savior had shown up to finally protect me from Bethany's insanity, but I could never have predicted how Marie would interpret the situation. At first, all she did was scream at us to break it up, and then she made Bethany put on a robe, march us both downstairs, and had us sit on opposite chairs in the living room until all 4 of our parents returned home. When Marie told them what had supposedly happened, I couldn't believe my ears. According to her, she'd caught us engaging in some kind of carnal act, that she could no longer be around 2 girls who would behave like that. And the worst part is, Bethany claimed that this was also true, that we'd been drawn to each other and needed Jesus. As my parents took me home that night in shame, I begged and pleaded with them to believe me that this wasn't what happened. I was way too young to even be thinking about anything like that, let alone with Bethany. And they said nothing as I talked over and over about how Bethany had always tried creeping me out ever since we were little kids, how the other neighborhood kids couldn't stand her, and how she alienated and ostracized everyone at school, how she would say terrible words and acted disrespectfully. I told them that, and I thought Bethany needed help, serious help. Eventually, thank God, they believed me. And yet somehow, this didn't make things any better. But you see, her parents believed me too, but the help they decided that she needed was some kind of camp for wayward teens rather than the therapy and support that I'd had in mind. And so Bethany was shipped off to what I later found out was a particularly notorious wilderness survival camp designed to scare kids straight into good behavior. And they kept Bethany there for over a year. And then when she came home, she didn't want to see anyone. She was homeschooled. She wanted to avoid me and everyone else. Our parents had remained friends during the whole ordeal of Bethany being at the camp, but as soon as she returned, they kind of just stopped spending time together. And the whole thing conflicts me so much. Bethany terrified me and emotionally hurt and scared a lot of people, but I never wanted her to have her entire personality stripped out of her or be forced to become the shell of herself that camp seemed to have turned her into. Eventually, I heard from my parents that Bethany had decided to dedicate her whole life to Jesus, and after graduation was set to become a nun. And as far as I know, that's exactly what ended up happening. She has no social media presence, and it's not like she had any other friends that could ask. We lost touch with her parents years ago, and now she's a very strange, eerie footnote in my life. But like I said, sometimes I have these nightmares where she crawls after me on all 4s, going full goblin mode, furious at me for the path that I set her on. And sometimes I wake up with sleep paralysis and I see Bethany standing there on the foot of my bed, just like she was on that final night. Only now she isn't just contorting her face to look like a goblin. In these sleep paralysis fits, she looks fully demonic. And whenever I finally break out of them and the specter of Bethany seems to disappear, I find myself wondering, did I possibly make things better for my weird best friend, or did I simply make them much, much worse? When I was growing up during high school, we had a quiet kid in class. You know the type that I'm talking about. This was post-Columbine, so quiet kid jokes were told, but kind of in a whispered tone. Nobody wanted to actually trigger the quiet kid or generally cause anything really bad to happen, and Kenny never actually showed serious signs of violence. Well, mostly anyway. Occasionally some of the cool kids would give him crap and he'd lash out and sort of yell at them, and whenever he got angry, his voice became incomprehensible, which really didn't help with people calling him an R-word or slow or a prospective danger to society. Now, a few things about Kenny that were actually true. His mom cut his hair in a bowl cut, and the 2000s you'd think that she'd absolutely have to know that this was going to bring the wrath of 1,000 high schoolers down on him. And he also carried a Spider-Man backpack at all times, one from the animated series, and it was before people thought things like this were retro and cool, and so that was another reason people dunked on poor Kenny. He could barely communicate if you spoke to him. He'd spend so long thinking about what you said that it felt like he was almost ignoring you, and you had to learn to just stand there and wait, and eventually Kenny would reply. Most times, anyway. Sometimes he really would just zone out, and you'd have to sort of yell his name to snap him back to attention. Now, looking back, Kenny shouldn't really have been in school with regular kids, or if he was, he should have had some kind of helper or something. And instead, this probably autistic, probably mentally ill kid was just left to fend for himself in the Thunderdome that is high school. I was so relieved when the new kid, Bradley, joined the school, and he was one of those tall, blonde, wholesome American boys who got along well with pretty much everybody. He excelled at sports, he was smart, the works, and I might have been a little jealous, I got to admit. And so Bradley became friends with basically everyone in no time, but of all the people he hung around the most, it was Kenny. And I guess you could say that he took him under his wing, but it didn't feel patronizing or protective or anything like that. He really brought Kenny out of his shell. It turns out that when he wasn't ostracized and constantly made fun of, Kenny was actually pretty funny, pretty smart guy. He was deeply intelligent and he was an absolute whiz at chess, and so was Bradley. And Bradley slowly integrated Kenny into various friendship groups. And for his part, Kenny, shockingly, integrated right back. And it was like this strange, unique, beautiful kid had been waiting beneath the surface for someone like Bradley to evolve him, and it was absolutely, utterly tragic that it just couldn't last. Now one day, I came in a little too late to school because I didn't have class first period, and as soon as I got there, I could tell some commotion was going on. Cops were there, and it looked like they were searching lockers, Kenny's locker in particular. I watched as they bagged something up and removed it from the premises, and shortly after that, a sniffling, crying Kenny was marched down the corridor in handcuffs. Now here's the story we were told. Bradley, as his best friend, had discovered that Kenny was planning to dose the food in the school cafeteria with some type of poison. This plan had been underway since well before Bradley joined the school, but instead of making the most of his newfound popularity, Kenny decided to go ahead with it anyway. Bradley had seen the poison in Kenny's locker and, despite his friendship with Kenny, couldn't let this slide and reported it to the school. One kid's dad was high up in the force and kind of snuck a look at the notes on the investigation, and it looked like they didn't have much on Kenny. He was claiming he didn't even know what that substance was. And then Bradley found the manifesto. It had been hidden behind a false wall in Kenny's locker that he had, and Bradley had somehow dug it out, and it detailed Kenny's plan to poison the food and how on the same day he was going to bring 3 pistols to school belonging to his dad and finish anyone off that way. Bradley brought this manifesto straight to the dean, and I guess he really hadn't thought this through. 1, why was Bradley able to access Kenny's locker, find that wall, and discover this manifesto when the cops didn't? 2, Kenny's dad had died many years ago, and while that didn't rule out the idea of him owning guns, he had been a staunch anti-gun campaigner, so the idea of Kenny accessing his father's guns seemed ridiculous. 3, the manifesto was supposedly written before Bradley even came to the school, but the food that Kenny claimed he was going to poison had not been on the menu until that year. Naturally, this made the school authorities and the cops suspicious. Kenny had been suspended from school at the time since there was no actual proof he planned on committing a crime, and then the next thing we knew, Bradley was no longer in attendance either. It turns out Brad was a psychopath who had been kicked out of his last school for antisocial behavior. His father owned an exterminator firm that specialized in killing rats. One of the few remaining uses of that poison is in rat poison. Kenny would not have been able to get his hands on that type of stuff easily. Bradley would have. And eventually, with warrants served, the cops were able to prove that bottles of this stuff were missing from Bradley's dad's inventory. And not only that, they were able to get access to the family computer, and what they found was very damning. A saved file containing the whole manifesto. According to the kid, whose dad was one of the lead detectives, Bradley broke down and sang like a canary. Not a remorseful one, but a proud one. When he arrived at the school and first saw Kenny and heard the quiet kid jokes, he was curious. He wanted to know what kind of punishment would be dealt out to someone who might be a school-based criminal, and he was curious about the effect it'd have on Kenny. Rumor has it that when asked, Bradley coldly admitted that he was curious if Kenny would commit some kind of act against himself. You know what I mean? I don't know exactly what happened to Bradley. He was expelled, but I'm not sure what kind of criminal charges were brought against him. His father doubled down on the misplaced poison having nothing to do with his son, and so we never saw Bradley again. And we never saw Kenny either. The whole incident broke him, and I wish I could say that he'd overcome his experiences, returned to school, and been embraced by us again. I know we would have welcomed him back, but Bradley broke him. Kenny spent the rest of his high school career in some kind of mental institute, and for all I know, he's still there. I've tried to find him a few times, but I've never been successful. And on the chance that you're living your best life, Kenny, and also somehow hear this, I wish you the best. Bradley, you seem to be a psychopath, and I hope you ended up locked away for the safety of everyone. Spending my teenage years around someone like you was the most chilling and horrific thing possible, and the way you tortured poor Kenny is unforgivable. Adults can be awful, but kids can be truly, truly evil. Growing up, I wasn't a small kid. No, I'm not going to be ashamed to say it. I was fat. Medically, I qualified as obese, and I suffered from some pretty severe depression following my parents' divorce. There was an emptiness in my life when my mom went off and left us, and I filled the void with food. I'm not that person anymore, but I'm not going to be ashamed that I was either. That's the kind of thing that leads down the path that I followed in the first place. And by the time I started high school, I weighed way over 200 pounds and I was very big. I hated gym class and I dreaded the showers even more. It's not like everyone in my grade was some jock or anything like that, but I was by far the biggest boy in freshman year. The only upside to it is that I was a tough little guy as well. The bullies soon gave up on any kind of physical violence against me because I could take it. Shove me against the lockers, I'd just bounce back. Literally too, I guess. Slap my fat rolls, I had a very high pain threshold. Call me fat? Well, yeah, I knew I was. I could hardly deny it. I didn't love hearing it, but just pointing out that I was a big boy only stung internally. And so yeah, I was bullied and it did upset me, but I was great at not showing it, and I think a lot of the kids respected that. There was one kid, though. His name was Neil, and he was as skinny as I was fat. Now, I was pretty short for my age, but he was a whole head shorter than me, a really tiny guy, but he wasn't some adorable little shorty. Neil was a mean one, and no mistake. You could tell from the glint in his eye and the perpetual smirk on his face. And rumor had it that Neil could be such a bully that he once made a senior guy cry. Nobody really seemed to know exactly how Neil was a bully. Kids just knew to be wary of him and keep away from him, and this resulted in a couple of things. One, Neil had no friends. Nobody wanted to actually spend time with him because he was so unpredictable and supposedly volatile. Now sure, people would be polite to him and nod hello in the halls, but nobody wanted to sit with him at lunch or invite him to social events or anything like that. And two, it meant that some of the more physical bullies had it in mind to take Neil down, and that's where I came in. One day I was sitting alone eating lunch in the courtyard because, like Neil, I also didn't have any actual friends, and so who should come and sit beside me but Neil himself? He asked if I wanted half of his sandwich, and to be honest, it did look really delicious. I really didn't know what to do. Neil, this famous idiot, was offering me food. Was there some catch to it? Like it was filled with razor blades or something? In the end, I decided that I was more scared of what would happen if I said no, so I took the sandwich. And this seemed to make Neil happy, and even more so when I actually ate it. I didn't really know what to say after that, so I just sort of asked him if he was having a good day. Neil ignored my question and told me that he had a proposal for me. Neil basically proposed that I act as his bodyguard, and in exchange, he'd make sure that I wasn't the target of bullies. I told him I wasn't really bullied anymore these days, and he grinned, that sort of snide grin that he had, and pointed out that this was because he had left me alone so far. It was a good point. Neil had never bullied me, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to find out what would happen if he did. And so I agreed to be his friend and bodyguard, and this arrangement somehow lasted all the way to junior year. Neil used me to cause all kinds of trouble. He'd pick on certain kids, really vile stuff, and then have me threaten to fight them, or in most cases, take any blows that would have been aimed at him. Sometimes he'd force me to beat up younger kids, younger than myself, as we got older. In junior year in particular, we saw a few freshman targets that Neil took great delight in having me hurt. Now, you may be wondering how Neil managed to have such a hold over me, especially since I wasn't that particularly thin-skinned. Well, Neil managed to find that chink in my armor: my mom. Anytime I tried to push back against Neil or deny him, then he'd throw a barb my way about how my mother had left because of her disgusting fat son and her autistic daughter and her fat arsler husband. Neil also seemed to know pretty intimate details of the man my mother had run off with and what she was doing now. When I asked Dad about this, he got really quiet and just sort of asked me who I'd heard this from, which was all the answer I needed. Neil was able to use my mother against me quite often, and that hurt. It really hurt. And so I took the path of the coward. I chose to hurt other people instead of letting Neil hurt me. And I know this makes me a bad person. I regret all of it, but it is what it is now. And like I said, I'm going to call things as they are, although in this case, yes, I am ashamed of who I was. Neil's influence over me almost ruined my high school career as well. My report cards went steadily downhill. Dad never punished me. He just got kind of sad. One time, he was a little bit drunk, and he asked where he was going wrong with me and what he could do to help me to get back on track. And it just about broke my heart. And instead of facing up to that, I said something incredibly mean to him that I still apologize for to this day. I told him he could stop being such an embarrassing loser. Now, meanwhile, I developed a reputation at school for being a bully and someone to avoid, so Neil was my only friend, really, for years. And somehow, Neil managed to twist things so it looked like I was the ringleader and he was my sidekick, so any trouble we got into, it was usually me who took the brunt of it. I remember one time, Neil persuaded me to scratch up the paint on the car belonging to one of the most popular seniors in school. If this guy had caught me, I think he was one of the few people in the school who would actually outdo me in a fight, and he would have pummeled me into the ground. Thankfully, we got away with that one. Towards the end of junior year, Neil developed a crush. The girl in question was an unassuming, bookish girl who was quiet and kept to herself. You know the type. Now, she was also the girl that I'd had a crush on for the last year as well, and I'm pretty sure that Neil knew this. Neil told me that he had a plan to ask her to date him. He just needed some time with her in the art classroom, and I had to stand guard to make sure nobody came along and unlocked the door. Now, I might have been a dumb kid, but I wasn't stupid. I knew that there was absolutely nothing good about what Neil might have planned, and so this one time, I said no. And Neil went nuts. Apparently, there were a lot of things that he'd been holding back, things that he knew about my mom, and according to him anyway, how my stepdad had been abusing my sister. And then he had all this evidence on his phone of my involvement and all the bullying, cut and edited in a way that looked like I was the sole culprit. In particular, there was minutes of footage of me vandalizing the senior's car. Neil threatened to reveal this to them and to reveal to the whole school the kind of loose woman my mother was and how she was allegedly pimping out her own daughter. And at that moment, I saw red. By this point, a lot of my fat had turned into muscle and I had a huge growth spurt. Neil was still tiny. I picked my bully up by the waist. I slammed him down on a table into the empty classroom we were conspiring in. And the crack I heard was almost as terrifying as Neil's screams. I knew I'd done something really, really terrible, something even Neil didn't deserve. And when it all came out, I didn't protect Neil, but I didn't try to protect myself either. I deserved a lot of the blame and I wanted to take it. After this, being sent to a military academy was my own choice. I'd scared myself stupid with my own rage, and I'd hurt people and I'd gotten out of control. Neil's family wanted to press charges, and the military academy also served as a compromise. And this is also how I found out that the man my mother had left the family for was Neil's father. This whole time, my new stepdad was Neil's biological dad who walked out on Neil's family when Neil was just a baby. and I can only guess that the whole thing was intended as some sort of roundabout revenge against me in the end. Military school was the making of me, really, and I took it like a duck to water. I graduated and then joined the military, where I'd stay there to this day. I hate the person I used to be, but I'm proud of the person I've become. And I heard that Neil took a very darker path and never tried to better himself. To a larger extent, I blame myself for this. I certainly see him as a victim in many circumstances. I try to make up for who I was every day. I serve our country, I donate to charity, I send money back to my dad to help my sister's care. Thankfully, Neil's claims of abuse towards my sister were lies aimed to disgrace his dad. Apparently, he's not even that bad of a guy. I don't want to know him, though. I just want to keep making amends for allowing one of the most effed up people I've ever known to dictate, dominate, and destroy my childhood. You may finish this story by hating me and thinking I'm a terrible person, and I wouldn't blame you, but I'm trying. I wish Neil had done the same, and from what I understand, he's done some pretty terrible things in the years since I've known him, and I can only hope that one day he takes his first steps onto the road to redemption that I'm attempting to walk myself. You can't take back the things you do, but you can try and make amends for them, even if it's too little and too late. When I was younger, in high school, I admit that I was a bit of a stoner, a sort of emo goth type who probably didn't take care of herself that well and smoked a little too much weed. Now, this was before weed was legal too, so we couldn't just walk to the store and pick some up. We'd spend our weekends hanging out in this sort of cubby hole under a bridge, not like the one from that famous dancing video you probably remember, and we'd turn it into a bit of a hangout space. Rugs, magazines, a battery-powered stereo, the works. Now, one rule was if you showed up, then you brought snacks. And there was one guy who didn't follow that rule, or any of them really, and his name was Birmingham. And that wasn't really his real name. I imagine that, but that's what he insisted we call him. Because get this, he'd been to Birmingham in England once on a vacation for like a month, and there were a bunch of ways Birmingham didn't fit in. He wasn't a goth or emo, he was more of a hippie. And he was this white dude with dreadlocks, although I'm not sure if they were dreads or whether his hair was really just that unkempt. Birmingham would never arrive with snacks either, and he'd never contribute free stuff to the den. He'd just stroll in and hang out while the rest of us put the work in. And while some of us might not have the best kind of hygiene, Birmingham had absolutely reeked of BO, and whoever got stuck sitting next to him, usually one of the girls, would have to develop a tolerance to his smell. Oh, and did I mention that Birmingham was 32? A 32-year-old stinking hippie hanging out with high school goths and emos, and he was not shy about hitting on some of the girls in the group. So, you're probably asking, why did we tolerate him? And the answer was simple. We were young, dumb, and he would buy us alcohol and provide us with weed. For a price, mind you, which he made no secret about skimming a profit from. He'd just shown up one day, told us that he could hook us up just as we'd been wondering how the hell to get into substance abuse. Spoiler, just don't. And he sort of just stuck around ever since. And so Birmingham, despite all of his flaws and age gap and being a creep, was very much always at our hangout. He acted like he was the king of the castle and we were his adoring servants, especially the women. Even though all of us resisted his quote-unquote charms, he behaved as if we constantly lusted after his stinky-ass body. He was gross, to put it mildly, and we were dumb enough to let him stick around anyways. And there were maybe 8 of us, including Birmingham, on and off, 4 girls, 3 high school guys, and this Birmingham guy. 2 of the guys were far too of losers to really ever stand up against him, and one of them was as much of a predator creep as Birmingham was. So between Birmingham and this other weirdo, whose name was Josh, us girls really had to watch ourselves. We just moved into junior year when Birmingham ramped up his behavior. He singled out a couple of the girls, they were named Sandy and Bridget, and started trying to get them to engage in some really strange actions with him. At first he offered free joints in exchange for this, and then it was an entire free baggie of weed, and then it was weed and unspecified pills. He must have been really desperate to get touched, as that's all he was aiming for, to start with anyway. And a rumor went around that Sandy did actually give in and even did some strange stuff with him for a bag of weed, and we didn't see her for about a week. And when she came back to the group, she seemed down and ashamed and wouldn't look anyone in the eye, and we got the impression that whatever experience she'd had with him had not been a good one. And knowing how pressurizing Birmingham could get, I could only imagine. Now, none of us wanted to bring it up with Sandy in case it wasn't that, but behind her back, most of the boys were not sympathetic, especially Josh, while obviously the girls felt bad for her. And we began talking about how to get rid of this Birmingham, but the boys were having none of it. He was our free ticket to weed and alcohol, and we weren't losing that just because Sandy wanted a freebie. These little assholes. I'm not going to pretend Sandy was innocent in this whole affair, but if you knew Birmingham, you'd know how far he'd tried to go to get what he wanted. And the fact that it had taken until now was a miracle. The thing that changed everything was when this new girl joined junior year and quickly became a member of our group. Her name was Summer, and ironically, she had almost jet black hair, completely natural, and she soon became one of us, and Birmingham was smitten, and so was Josh. This was the first rift. Summer was one of those girls who was confident and she dressed provocatively, but she had no interest in doing anything with a dude. And so began a competition between Josh and Birmingham to be the first one to get Summer without clothes. They weren't trying to sleep with her, not yet anyway. They just made a bet to be the first one to consensually see her, and the consensual part wasn't out of respect or anything, it was just for bragging rights between these two weirdos. Naturally, Summer didn't appreciate this from the start, having two guys, one of whom was literally 32 and stank, trying to get her to do something like flashing, and she began asking some of us privately why we tolerated this weirdo, and so we explained. And then she asked why we tolerated Josh, and we started realizing that there really wasn't actually a good reason for that. He was a creepy idiot too, but he normally targeted girls outside the group. There were all sorts of rumors circulating about the way he'd treated past girlfriends. Summer decided she'd try to handle it, and her solution was to offer some kind of vague incentive to Josh or Birmingham, to whichever one beat the other in a fight. And very clearly beat, no question that they'd won, i.e., she meant one of them to put the other in the hospital. Summer had expected them to say no, that it wasn't worth it, but apparently this high school boy and this 32-year-old man were willing to risk killing each other over seeing some girl's body, and so it was decided that the fight would be that Friday night. Summer had become my personal best friend, really, so she was panicking to me on the telephone about this. And of course she didn't want anyone to get hurt, she just wanted both of them to just screw off. We couldn't think of any solutions other than to try and de-escalate the fight or call the cops if we really had to. And ultimately, none of that needed to happen. We all showed up to the hangout on Friday. Birmingham made some disgusting crude comment about how he was going to win the fight and Summer would be compelled to do all sorts of unspeakable things. And that's when he attacked. Only the attack didn't come from Josh. Now remember I said the other two guys who were too much of babies to ever stand up against Birmingham? Well, it turns out that wasn't true. One of them, a guy named Craig, suddenly went flying across the room, slamming Birmingham against the concrete wall of the hangout and pinning him there by the throat. Craig was a big guy, tall and large, and he had no problem holding this skinny, wiry Birmingham guy in place. And it all came out. How much we all hated Birmingham, and how he was a stinking, vile parasite who could only get with women by trying to bribe children with drugs. How none of us could stand him, basically everything we'd ever wanted to say to him. You see, we found out later that Craig had been developing a burning, powerful crush on Summer, and the more Birmingham and Josh talked about her like that, the more quietly and fuming he got. And then he just snapped. We watched in silent awe as Craig headbutted Birmingham square in his nose, audibly breaking it, and we listened as he threatened to gut him violently if he ever showed his face around the hangout again, or even around town. And then he pulled the hunting knife out of his belt. That's the exact moment Josh walked in, looking sick and nervous, presumably for his fight. You'd expect this to distract Craig, but it didn't. He held the knife up to Birmingham's throat so tightly that it drew beads of blood and told him how serious he truly was. And then Craig dropped some info we didn't know. He mentioned the name of his family, a well-known Irish-American gang in town who were, to say the least, serious business. And when Birmingham heard that, that's what finally broke him. He began to cry, begging forgiveness and apologizing to Craig. And Craig said it wasn't him who deserved the apology, it was Summer. And Summer just shook her head and said she didn't care, she just wanted this guy out of there. So Craig let him limp away, and that was the last we ever saw of that creepy drug dealer again. Now meanwhile, Josh had been watching the whole thing with a sort of sick look on his face, as I said, and Craig turned to him, tucked the knife back into his belt, and just gave him this look that sort of said, "You could be next." And the group kind of dissipated after that. Nobody really had the energy to hang out with each other with all that violence hanging in the air, and Summer and I stayed friends, and the other girls and guys sort of drifted away. We're still friends to this day, and sometimes Summer and I talk about how we were regularly hanging out with 3 different guys who were scary in their own way. And there was Josh, who I later found out got kicked out of college for his conduct with a female student, and then there was Birmingham, who, looking back, was more terrifying than I truly realized, an adult male trying to use intoxicants to get underage women into bed with him. And while he was maybe the least dangerous, Craig was definitely the scariest. Nothing suggested he'd explode that day, and nothing gave away that he was the black sheep of an extremely violent family. And all we can be grateful for is that Craig's first outburst of rage was directed at the right target.